So when you say you have a biblical view of creation, does it include dragons and seven-headed sea monsters? Stick around and I'll tell you why it should. We're here to study the Bible. We're here to study the Bible. We're here to study the Bible. Might get us in trouble, 'cause we're being intentionally provocative with our intros. Now, clearly that introduction was meant a little tongue-in-cheek, but if you do read the Old Testament, you're going to find some really weird stuff surrounding the creation stories, not only in Genesis, but especially when you get into the poetic texts. The way that the ancient authors thought about creation is very, I'm going to use a scary word again, it's very mythical in the way that they're understanding both the makeup of the world and how that world came into existence. The psalm I want us to look at in this video is Psalm 74. Now, most people would date Psalm 74 as an exilic psalm, or a psalm that takes place after Judah has been destroyed by Babylon. This was a bombshell moment in Judah's history. And the reason why I keep saying Judah and not Israel is because at this time, Israel and Judah were separate political entities. The kingdom had been divided into two separate political and even religious centers of being. We had Israel in the north and we have Judah in the south. Israel was taken care of by Assyria in the 8th century. Judah hung on for a little bit longer but was eventually destroyed by Babylon in 586. And as I mentioned in the last video, when this happens, a lot of people are uprooted from their home and they are spread out in Babylon. In other words, they are in a foreign land attempting to understand what their relationship is now with God, with no temple, with no religious system, with no ties to the promised land. It was complete chaos in many senses of the term. So in Psalm 74, the psalmist is attempting to address some of this. Begins in verse 1. "O God, why do you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture?" This is really thick poetic language, basically calling God to task and reminding God of what has just happened. Verse 2, "Remember your congregation, which you acquired long ago, which you redeemed to be the tribe of your heritage. Remember Mount Zion, where you came to dwell. Direct your steps to the perpetual things." One commentator really plays into this idea with regard to the permanence. Direct your steps to the permanent ruins, he translates. Here in the NRSV, direct your steps to the perpetual ruins. The enemy has destroyed everything in the sanctuary. This is a massive problem for the people because in their frame of understanding, the sanctuary, the temple, that is where God resides. That is where the presence of God is located. And now that Babylon has completely demolished it, the people of God have no, in their mind, ties to the presence of God. God has been removed, God is absent, and now they're trying to figure out what in the world is going on. Verse 4, "Your foes have roared within your holy place. They set up their emblems there. At the upper entrance, they hacked the wooden trellis with axes, and then with hatchets and hammers, they smashed all of its carved works. They set your sanctuary on fire. They desecrated the dwelling place of your name, bringing it to the ground." This is the lament that is written in light of what can only be described as a life-altering historical event in the lives of God's people. And now they find themselves outside of the promised land with no temple, with no presence of God, with no access to God. And they're writing this communal lament calling God to task. And now this is where the intro is going to come into play, because in verse 12, there's a shift and the psalmist begins to look back to the stories of the past. But he does so in a very, very odd way for us because we don't necessarily understand the language that's being used. Let me demonstrate. Verse 12. Yet God my King is from of old. See, there's a turn now when we're going to, not necessarily an affirmation of faith or trust, but we're going back, still calling God to task, saying, remember who you were and do something about the sanctuary in ruins. This God, my King, is from of old. It was working salvation in the earth. These are the things that God did. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. Now, this is the NRSV, and I'm not certain what the NIV does with this translation right off the top of my head. Hopefully, Tessa can throw it into the screen here just so we can compare. Dragons is a translation of the Hebrew word taninim, which is also something that shows up in the book of Genesis in chapter 1. When God creates the sea monsters, it says in Genesis 1:21, and every living creature that moves of every kind. The taninim is the dragons, and God, it says, has broken the heads of the dragons in the waters. The mayim in Hebrew. In verse 14, it says, you crushed the heads of Leviathan. Now, in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, Leviathan was understood to be a seven-headed sea monster. And oftentimes we'll find the Tananim and the Leviathan in concert with one another, because these are mythical concepts where God, in the midst of creation, was subduing and taming the chaotic forces of the world, namely the dragons and the sea monsters. Now, again, in the ancient Near East, the water and the great deep, another term from Genesis chapter 1, it says, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, the Tehom. In other words, you don't see a creation ex nihilo, a creation out of nothing. You see in Genesis 1 a creation that is a shaping of already existent properties, water, and this sort of like sandy, murky sort of elements, and God is shaping and moving and placing things and dividing the waters from above and the waters below and bringing the dry ground away from the waters. And God has these materials, and it says that there's a darkness over the face of the deep while a wind or a spirit from God is sweeping over the face of the waters. And for an ancient audience, what they were hearing was, oh dang, this God is taming chaos without any sort of violent means. Now that goes away when we get to the Psalm, because he's destroying dragons, he's breaking their heads, and he's crushing the heads of Leviathan. But in Genesis 1, God is taming chaos simply by being. His breath or his wind or his spirit is hovering over the waters as if to say, you can't touch me. God is creating the sea monsters and putting them in their place because they posed no threat to him. Do you see what's happening here? Now, the psalmist is picking up on some of this shared mythical language. I should also note that Genesis 1 is really, whether intentionally or not, we don't know, but playing off against some of the other creation texts that were around at this time. And all of those texts had gods that were warring against one another, attempting to tame chaos in violent ways. And Genesis 1 is saying, nope, that's not how it happened with our God, who is the God to be praised. Now, why this shows up in Psalm 74 is because they're going back to these stories demonstrating God's sovereignty and God's power and saying, do that again. Be that God again for us. You broke the heads of the dragon, the Tananim. You have crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You cut openings for springs and torrents. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You established the luminaries and the sun, and now the creation language becomes even more potent and clear. You have fixed the boundaries of the earth. You made summer and winter. This is all looking back to creation. And the psalmist is saying everything's in chaos right now. The sanctuary is burned to the ground. We're in exile. But remember who you used to be and be that again. Tame chaos again. And then the psalm switches and goes into this third section. Remember this, O Lord, how the enemy scoffs and an impious people reviles your name. Do not deliver the soul of your dove to the wild animals. Do not forget the life of your poor forever. Do something. Be the God that you were. Be the God that tames chaos. Be the God that breaks the heads of the dragons and the seven-headed sea monsters, the Leviathan. Be that God who is powerful and says to chaos, no, not today. Do not deliver the soul of your dove to the wild animals. Do not forget the life of your poor forever. Have regard for your covenant, for the dark places of the land are full of the haunts of violence. Do not let the downtrodden be put to shame. Let the poor and the needy praise your name. Rise up, O God, plead your cause. Remember how the impious scoff at you all day long. Do not forget the clamor of your foes, the uproar of your adversaries that goes up continually. Be the God that we know you are. And the way they tell this story is not modern, it's not scientific, it's highly theological. And it's looking back to some of the same language in Genesis, because throughout the Bible, the way that the authors were referring to creation, it's not scientific. And it's not modern. It's ancient and highly theological and mythical. And even in Genesis 1, we see these images of dragons and sea monsters. And the point there is not that God has created everything from nothing. The point there is God has put everything in its proper place. And there is no reason to fear because God has tamed chaos. Here's a pretty bad pastoral tie. Our lives at times feel chaotic. Our world most certainly feels chaotic for different reasons at different points. The month of March and April were chaotic for different reasons than the months of January and February. But just like the psalmist who looks back to these pivotal moments and says, be that, and holds God accountable to being that. Perhaps we also can learn some of these languages in our prayers where we remember the moments throughout Israel's shared history and we say, be that God again, because that is who we need. So while your life might feel like it's in chaos, remember these images of the Spirit of God hovering over the mythical deep and saying, not today. Remember the images of God saying to the sea monsters and the dragons, you belong in your proper place. I am Lord over you. Remember the images from the psalm, which are different, but still give us this feeling of God breaking the heads of the dragons and crushing the heads of the Leviathan. And we with the psalmist say, be that God again. So this is a powerful psalm set within a moment of Israel's history that is scary and has raised questions for them about their identity and their future. And it has a lot of resonance with maybe where we are now or where we have been at different points in our life. So we're going to throw the words up on the screen and hopefully through some meditation you can find them meaningful.